So it's a pleasure to be here and an honor to be invited to address this conference. I am a Greek, French, American investment advisor and angel investor. I have moved to Cyprus recently, about 2 years ago, but I've been working here since 1993. The subject of my presentation today is an assessment of the national investment strategy as we can assess it up until today, and also a presentation of the risks which we can observe and a partial or possible risk mitigation strategy. The information I'll present is in the public domain, so it is it's a narrative, it's not a prescription, it's not a recommendation, and I'm available if there are any follow-on questions. Also, the presentation itself is a little bit complex, but it will be distributed at the end of the conference. There are three subjects. The first is looking at the investment strategy and its results. The second is to outline the risks going forward, and the third is to examine some options for a risk mitigation strategy. There is no formal national investment strategy in Cyprus, but there are initiatives which occur in different sectors, and the initiatives are basically located in three key pillars. The first is attraction of foreign direct investment in key sectors. These include shipping, property, finance, energy, technology, and other sectors. The second is domestic investment or policy-led reforms. This is typically activities which occur by the government of Cyprus and are more driven by the public sector. So, for instance, it's investment in education, in developing the policy framework for energy and transport, healthcare, and so on and so forth. And the third area, the third cluster of initiatives, if you will, is solving bad debt and non-performing loans and improving the regulatory framework in the public sector. And examples of initiatives here include the cooperative bank liquidation, which occurred recently, restructuring non-performing loans, managing public debt, and so on and so forth. So below these three pillars, we also have a series of incentives, institutions, and a regulatory framework which is affecting and determining how business is done. So I'm sure you know, under the incentive framework, there is the Investor Citizenship program, which is obviously playing a major role, the Investor Residency program, and others. Cyprus has some very good institutions which are not just involved in regulation, but are also involved in promoting Cyprus as an investment location. And probably the greatest challenge that we face today is that of regulatory changes, and these changes are typically driven by either the OECD or the European Union, and in some cases by the US Treasury or other bilateral actors. I won't present all of these in depth, but I will just dip in and out and offer some examples. Two very well-known examples, and we have quite a few representatives here from these sectors today, are shipping and finance, and it's very interesting how these two sectors have both developed. In each case, the government has made it a strategic priority to attract foreign direct investment. It has done so by developing a very beneficial regulatory framework. In the shipping case, the tax on net tonnage. In the financial sector, the Alternative Investment Fund and the Registered Alternative Investment Fund frameworks. Advantages for the destination, for the jurisdiction, include full compliance in shipping with EU and IMO, and on finance with UC, ITS, AIFM, and MIFID. And there's a very strong public-private cooperation, and that extends to regulation, but it also extends to promotion. The results here, I think, are very clear. Cyprus now has over 1,500 ships registered under its flag. It's the third largest EU flag. It employs over 45,000 people ashore and 55,000 people afloat. And besides the actual flag income, there is income from ship management revenue, which is estimated at about 528 million euro in 2018, out of a GDP of about 20 billion. That is a remarkable achievement for an economy of this size. The finance side has been developing a little bit more recently. So it has doubled assets under management to 4.8 billion by March of 2018. Obviously, that's a relatively low amount when you compare it with other financial centers, but again, Cyprus is starting. It is managing to attract a lot of regulated entities, and it's expanding the range of regulatory compliance and cooperation it has with other jurisdictions. So I think these are two very interesting examples which show that, when the government sets priorities, when it follows a strategy consistently well, when it pays attention to regulation, it can achieve some fairly good results. The property sector is another area. This is, as you know, many of our sponsors and many of the exhibitors here today are from the sector. The skyline is changing. There are literally billions of euro pouring into the sector right now in both residential high-rise towers, also commercial property. The drivers here are the Investor Citizenship program. They are banks exchanging debt for property. There is a high demand for student housing and seasonal labor housing, and there's a very high demand for the tourism market and the buy-to-let market. What is interesting here is most of us probably have an understanding when we think about large skyline projects that there's actually a lot of projects going on. The number of transactions is actually relatively low. It was 8,734 transactions in 2017. It is growing at a very high rate by Cypriot standards. So I guess the large question here is to what extent the property market is becoming overheated, and of course to what extent the Investor Citizenship program can be continued. I want to give just very briefly two examples of longer term sectors. Energy, as you know, Cyprus started the first licensing round in 2007. By 2011, Noble had made exploratory drilling in the Aphrodite field. There was a third licensing round in 2016. There were discoveries last year and this year by Eni and ExxonMobil. This is a longer term bet. It's going to be very capital intensive. There are huge geopolitical and technical risks. But again, I think it illustrates very clearly that the government is in a position through successive administrations and through successive elections to set a strategic target, go about it systematically, and actually start getting results. The final sector I want to look at very briefly is education, and this is probably a sector that we don't think about as being a key investment sector. But what's interesting is that when Cyprus joined the EU in 2004, it made a very systematic attempt to comply to the letter and the spirit of EU regulations. And what we have today in higher education is we have 49 public and private higher education institutions. But for me, what is the most important statistic is that this year was the first year, 2017 was the first year, when the number of foreign students enrolled in Cyprus was actually greater than the number of Cypriot students enrolled. So again, I think this is a very interesting case that by looking at the regulatory framework, by making policy-led reforms, by sticking to the letter and the spirit of the law, there can be amazing results achieved in this case, 15 years. So I think that's, again, a very, very positive indication of how things can go. The results are clear on the GDP tables. We see this chart here shows real quarterly year-on-year GDP growth. We have clearly emerged from the recession, which followed the bank haircuts in 2013. We reached the highest level, 6.0% quarterly growth. That's year-on-year. That's a very, very high number. That's quite an achievement. And for the past 5 quarters, we've been running at about 4% quarterly growth. Again, something very, very positive, particularly compared with a lot of European economies. One of the problems we see is that despite the bank bail-in and everything we learned in 2013 about the public sector, government expenditure is still running higher than government revenue. So in 2019, we had a deficit of about 1 billion euro, and government expenditure at 9.2 billion is roughly nearly 50% of GDP. So clearly, even though in the private sector we have some amazing achievements, in the public sector we still have some way to go to restructure operations and make them more effective. That's confirmed by public sector employment. This table shows total employment in the public sector. It has been rising rapidly since 2015. In 2015, we had 63,940 people employed. In 2018, that number reached 67,000. And we're on track basically to continue expanding public employment in the coming years. And the final chart I want to show with some data is on credit and non-performing loans. In 2014, so the year after the haircut, Cyprus had a total of 57 billion euro in loans and a non-performing loan share of 48%. Again, when you compare this to GDP, it is an astoundingly high number. By 2018, the loan book had shrank to about 34 billion, and the non-performing loan share fell to 30%. That's about 50% of GDP. Again, these numbers are open to some debate because some of these loans have merely been reprofiled, and the banks basically have been left with a large number of potentially overvalued properties, and I'm speaking diplomatically here, on their balance sheets, and that of course is affecting their ability to make loans in the future. Cyprus is doing relatively well in some rankings. In the World Economic Forum ranking, it has risen to 44th place worldwide. The main problems observed are access to financing, inefficient government bureaucracy, insufficient capacity to innovate. In the World Bank Business Ranking Survey, it has essentially fallen. The first rank is the highest, so the higher you go in numbers, the lower you're going globally. And finally, if we look at FDI, foreign direct investment, it's clear that Cyprus is not on the top 10 lists in any metrics that really count, whether we're looking at overall, whether we're looking at economic potential, FDI performance, innovation. So there's still clearly some way to go. I will touch very briefly on investor citizenship because that's one of the main risks that we see. Statistics here are difficult to get, but from what's been reported publicly, a total of 3,255 passports have been granted between 2009 and 2017. There's a cap at probably about 700 passports which will be issued per year. I believe that there's very high foreign demand. I don't believe that foreign demand is going to decrease. And I do want to remind everyone that so far citizenship is an exclusive area of national sovereignty. So you may hear the odd complaint from the EU or the OECD, but unless something radically changes, Cyprus, as also every other EU member state, is free to grant citizenship to whoever it chooses, and I hope that will not change. Conclusions, very quickly. The economy remains dependent on foreign capital inflows and expertise. Successive governments have a strong track record of designing incentives and regulation and attracting investment. If this is done correctly, this brings very, very strong results, and I think many of the people in this room are also responsible for this performance. And the reform of the public sector is a critical issue. And here I mean issues like the quality of governance, the quality of strategic planning, and the move to e-government rather than a paper-based authorization type of governance. There are obviously a huge number of risks on the horizon, and the risks obviously differ depending on the sector you're in. I've made just a very brief catalog of them. The first one is geopolitical risks. We can look at risks which involve Turkey. We can look, and the example of Turkey blockading Eni's drill rig is a very good example of that. In my opinion, we're overdue for a conflict between Israel and its neighbors. Unfortunately, tensions are increasing, and we see a lot of signs that we may be reaching the boiling point soon. And also, unfortunately, relations with Russia or between the United States and Russia or the European Union and Russia are still relatively tense. And this may lead to further embargoes or other issues that limit the business relationship, such as the recent decision essentially to look at Russian bank accounts in Cyprus. I'm not going to comment on the causes, I'm not going to make a judgment on that, but I do want to point out that it is in everyone's interest to have, I think, a balanced relationship in this regard. The chances of any of these three are significant, and the likely impact on Cyprus is going to be equally significant. Another exogenous factor is regulatory overshoot. Cyprus is in many cases over-complying with regulations passed by the OECD and the European Union. To give just a very quick example, we recently had to pay a translator in Moscow 180 euro for a translation. We did a bank transfer. Our bank asks us, give us the contracts and the invoices and provide justification. Normally, you only have to do this for amounts of about 10,000 euro or up, not for 180 euro. So there is a lot of overshoot. There's a lot of overcompliance, which essentially is just increasing costs, increasing bureaucratization, and it's not really leading to anything useful. The US Treasury is put on this list precisely because of the impact it's had on Russian companies and banking in Cyprus. There is severe pressure, and a number of bank accounts have been closed. This is resulting in deposit flight, it's resulting in investor flight. It means that the asset base and the income of Cypriot banks falls even further, and confidence in Cyprus diminishes. And if you ask me, is any of this contributing towards a better anti-money laundering situation or a better anti-terrorist financing situation, I would argue that probably it is not. So it's the impact this is having is significant. Finally, as we mentioned, there is an international financial crisis already brewing. We see this whether in terms of the US-China trade war, which has resulted in a $2 trillion loss in valuations in the past week alone. We see it in the potential of a further European debt crisis. We see it in the potential of a further European political crisis. The likely impact here will be lower capital and trade flows and probably a synchronized recession, and the chance here is going to be very, very high of this occurring. We also have quite a few endogenous risks. Regulatory error or capture. The issue here is whether the Cypriot regulatory authorities have the resources necessary to implement their mission. For example, are Forex companies properly regulated in Cyprus? I don't have an answer, but a lot of anecdotal evidence shows that this is an extremely complex task, and the potential is that there are a lot of minefields waiting to be detonated in some areas. The likely impact here will be further damage to the business reputation and financial damage to investors in specific segments. Regulatory overshoot, we discussed already. Revisions to the investor citizenship program or the high net worth individual incentives may have to be done. For instance, the OECD recommends very strongly that for a foreign investor, the minimum residency time is 120 days. As you know, the Cypriot law is for 60 days, which is extremely competitive. So there may be some changes to the Cypriot status, which will again affect the attractiveness of Cyprus compared to other jurisdictions. One of the main problems that I'm sure we all face are higher labor input costs and other input costs. It's becoming more difficult to recruit and retain staff and to compensate them, and in general costs are rising. We don't foresee any change to this. It looks set to continue. A banking issue. We know that it's becoming more expensive to bank in Cyprus for foreign investors. We know that compliance costs are rising, bureaucracy is rising, compliance and so on is rising, and at the same time, it's almost impossible to get any sort of credit to fund investments. So eventually, this is not a sustainable situation. If you go to a jurisdiction like Dublin now, you are deluged by capital. There's more capital available than there are investment opportunities, and decisions are made extremely rapidly, and there's a very wide mix of capital credit available, everything from venture capital, development loans, private equity, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, this is not set to change. We don't see the entrance of any new capital players in Cyprus, or if we do, it's mainly to use Cyprus as a jurisdiction and to lend outside Cyprus. So this is really a key problem for the economy. The final key issue is the one of government effectiveness and the extent to which the government can reform the public sector and create a level playing field. I think anyone who is a foreign investor has seen that there is, in many cases, one law for domestic investors and one law for foreign investors. We've seen that the court system takes far too long to hear cases and to decide them. We see that taxes and costs are increasing continually while the quality and speed of public sector operations is falling. Key institutions like the Registrar of Companies have not adapted to the internet age at all. You can go to Poland today. Actually, you don't have to go to Poland. You can go to the website of the Ministry of Finance and you can register a company online in Poland in about 30 minutes, and it costs something like 75 euro or something like that. So Cyprus is really slipping behind in a lot of areas, and in some of these competitive areas, relatively new entrants like Lithuania have now a global role to play. Lithuania is a leader in attracting fintech investment, and they probably have the best regulatory system for licensing fintech investments right now in Europe. So we definitely need to do better. Now, I'll just run through risk mitigation very, very quickly. It obviously depends what sector you're in, how you're financing, where you're trading, and so on and so forth. But the basic question I think we all need to ask ourselves in the next 4 or 5 years is whether Cyprus is the best EU jurisdiction in which to do business. That's heavily dependent on what sector you're in and how you're financed, but it may be that Cyprus becomes a better holding company jurisdiction than an actual operational jurisdiction. Again, unless the country itself becomes really committed to competitiveness. Related to that is break-even. It used to be relatively easy to manage a company in Cyprus. Today, it's much more complex. We have regulatory compliance, we have Cyprus substance issues, and everyone needs to ask themselves, are the tax savings you're getting here high enough to justify the added costs that you need to achieve them? And again, that's heavily dependent on each company, each sector. There are several defensive approaches that you can do in banking. I would strongly recommend having multiple banking relationships inside and outside the EU, and having at least one fintech provider. If anyone has applied for a credit card by someone like Revolut or N26, I think you see immediately the potential of fintech. And what's interesting is that these companies are moving into corporate banking as well as personal banking. On the staffing side, companies are going to need to look very carefully at how they attract and retain talent, including offshoring or even onshoring within the EU. I believe it's now almost impossible to run 100% of your staffing needs within Cyprus. Certainly in the tech sector where we're involved, it's absolutely impossible. There is no way that there's a wide or deep enough tech ecosystem here to support real global tech investments. In the property sector, it's clear that current valuations of older property favor buying rather than renting, and that Larnaca and Paphos remain significantly undervalued compared to Limassol and Nicosia. So again, there are a lot of decisions that need to be made. And there are also some more aggressive risk mitigation approaches you can do rather than just cost cutting. You can look at cost sharing. The idea of developing alliances or partnerships with other firms. We all face, I believe, the same challenges. We can look at investments in digital productivity. We can look at consolidation. Cyprus has an oversaturation of many small, less productive service providers, and they have many companies that have a generational change, which is occurring now. So there is a very good opportunity for platform plays, for mergers and acquisitions, and other consolidation. And then finally, there's a lot of room for investments in innovation and disruption. So areas like telecoms. Why do we pay such a high price and we have such low quality of telecom provision? It's a mystery, right? Co-working spaces, other Cyprus substance solutions, seasonal staff housing. These are all investments which have a relatively good return on capital and are relatively straightforward to do. But even traditional sectors like HoReCa, hotels, retails, catering, there are lots of opportunities for consolidation and mergers in this area. So this is just a very brief introduction to the situation as we see it today. To summarize, the government is doing a relatively good job in terms of attracting investment in key sectors. There is sometimes a bit of daylight between the stated aspirations and the actual achievement. There's also a lot of room for improvement, particularly when compared with more agile or more nimble jurisdictions like Dublin, Vilnius, Luxembourg, or some other areas. Definitely, there are major threats on the horizon. It's difficult to quantify these, again, depending on what sector you're in. But I think that we can no longer assume that we'll be in a stable business environment, either as regards costs or risks within Cyprus or due to exogenous factors. So this is, again, a quick introduction. I'd now like to give the floor to Ajay, who will talk more about his experience and investing in Cyprus. Thank you.